Well, we are back. Okay, so we're going to take a look at centering again and opening and building the wall. This time a little faster, all in one video, from an aerial point of view. So here's my wheel head. It's clean, dry. Here's my ball of clay. I have all my tools ready, water, we're ready to go. So I'm going to start with more of a spherical shape this time, just because I think that's often natural for beginners, and that would work just fine. A sphere has convex surfaces all over, so no matter what way you put this down, things should work out okay. All right, so let's get this rotating, and again we're going to start with a little bit of impacting. And this time I'm going to do this pretty emphatically. I'm going to do this a lot to give you a sense of how this should work. And I think you can see, actually in this aerial video, we'll be able to see a lot less of what's happening, but certain perspectives on certain parts of the process will be much better from this point of view. So that impact centering, and this is what I'll often call this, is impact centering, can do quite a lot. If our clay is all off to one side, this would represent an irregularity. Impact centering can do a lot for us to get that work done and not have it be a struggle. Often if we have great irregularities in the clay, it's lumpy, there's things moving all this way and that, it can be quite a struggle when we start with the water to center that. So we want to make that as easy as possible. If I have an amount of clay that's jutting way off to one side, as this is here, I want to move that inward, right? I don't want the work of centering to be overly difficult, meaning any more difficult than it really needs to be. And if you find yourself having a lot of trouble, you can always do little things to, in addition to impact centering to help speed it up. For example, the most difficult portion of the clay to center is the bottom third. So this would be the top third, here would be the bottom third. If that's really a struggle for you, go ahead and take your wooden knife, brace your hands, and cut a little bit of that away into a more on-centered fashion there. Just get rid of the excess. And then when you start centering that most difficult portion, the very bottom third, and this is in terms of height when I say the bottom third, if that's already pretty much centered, well, you'll have just a lot less work to do and you can move on and become more of a more proficient at the other parts of the process. So nonetheless, we've done our impact centering. It can only go so far, and now we're going to start with the water and a little bit more speed from the wheel. So I'm going to wet my hands down, get them really slippery. I think something to mention that we normally wouldn't have to think about, but during this process is while you're at the studio, you will have to wear a mask, right? That's just how things are working there at the studio. Be sure you have a mask that fits well and doesn't move and slide around. Your hands are all muddy, and it's going to be really problematic to keep reaching up and playing with that mask. Mask is going to get covered in clay. So be sure to have something that fits well and doesn't move around a whole heck of a lot. We do have some masks in the ceramic studio that they're basically like an N95 dust mask. They work pretty well and they don't move around at all. So if you want one of those, just let me know and I'll get you one of those. All right, first push typically is more of a downward push. This secures the clay to the wheel head even just a little bit further, and generally we'll lower it down to a little bit of a lower position so that we can have a little better control of it. So that can look like a lot of things. It can look like this, it can look like this, or it could look even like this. Whatever's most comfortable for you. The most important thing here is when you join your hands together, just by touching them together or even interlocking them in some fashion, one tool works better than two independent tools. One tool works better than two independent tools. This will always be the case. A couple other quick things that we didn't mention in the other video. Find points of stability. You probably can't see this on your screen, but elbows on your knees. to kind of brace the arms and have points of stability everywhere you can find it. That would likely be both elbows on both of your knees if you're in a sitting position. I'm actually in a standing position, so I'll draw my elbows in against my rib cage as a way to give my arms a little bit more of a bracing there. So that can help a lot too. So I'm going to do my first push in this fashion. We should remember, anytime we push the clay down, it's going to squeeze outward. Can't go through the wheel head, obviously, so if we push down, that's going to move out. If I have a hand here to kind of capture that, as it squeezes and moves outward, out through here, I'm that much better off. So if this is a mold and I can keep that still, the clay should just fill that space, basically. So let's see if that's actually true. I'm going to connect the hands as always. And I'll leave a little space there so that you can see how the clay will disperse out and then fill into that part of the hand. There we go. Okay. So that might look like it's nearly centered. I think you can see, though, there's just a little bit of wobble to the form. And when we draw it back upwards, likely we'll see more irregularities that we just can't see right now because it's squashed down kind of flat. So I'm going to now squeeze from both sides, and so the clay should rise just a bit. You can see this hand, I'm not just here like this. This hand is actually covering what I would call as the shoulder of this mass of clay at the same time. If I'm simply to squeeze from both sides, that's great and the clay does rise, but what I often end up with is a lot of problems up on top here. Let me lower that back down for us. But if I can squeeze and then kind of cup my hand over the top edge, possibly with both hands, what'll happen is that clay rises, yet I guess what I'm doing here is just mostly my thumb. The clay rises, as you can see, but the thumb is there to kind of, so it fills into that shape. And if this is turning and you have a shape or a form there, it's going to, basically abide by it. So that can be a very useful thought when you're trying to get the clay centered quickly. Remember, displacement, and it will fill the space that you leave for it. So now I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. I'm going to be moving the clay upward and then back downward again. Upward and back downward again. And the centering process usually is that. It's sort of moving the clay up, cast a spiral in the upward direction, move the clay back down, we cast a spiral in the downward direction, and eventually those two things cancel each other out, and we end up with something that in this case is not gone, but is centered, right? It's controlled. And this mass of clay is roughly at that point right now. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next step, which is opening. You can see periodically I'll wipe my hands free of some of the slurry. Slurry is just a word for liquid clay that you don't want around. Slip would be the word for liquid clay that you do want around for decorating, for welding, things like that. If it helps you periodically, just clean your wheel head off. Give yourself clear sight of what's going on, what you're working on. So let's open this up. So people like different stances for this. This is one way to do this, is to kind of collect your hands around the outside of the form. Again, we're talking about that compass sort of theory that we're talking about. Collect your hands around the outside of the form. You can use the thumbs to create that initial divot, or maybe even drill down a certain distance. I find this way to be, though, a little limiting because my thumbs are really short. So what I tend to do is I might start that way. There's my little well. I'm going to fill that with a little bit of water. But I might move to this. So this is a hand on the outside perimeter. That's the fixed point of the compass. Here's the drill, or the pencil, if we want to keep that compass analogy going. I'm going to join my hands together, and I then can drop in and push downward. I'm just a bit off the center point so that that's scribing a line or a circle. And let's remember that I can drop a line wherever I want to with a compass. So I don't need all these ridges right now. We'll just ignore them for the moment. We'll get back to opening. But that's kind of the principle of the compass. So I'm going to push down a little bit further. I often will stop short, and I try to be generous with how much of a floor I leave. I think a general good thickness of floor is, a 1/2 inch or even 3/4 of an inch at this part of the process. That can be hard to judge sometimes, though. So one way that you can measure the depth of what you have there is to grab your needle tool. You'll have to forgive me, I'm looking for one right now. Here we go. So grab your needle tool. You can insert that into the floor, push down until it hits the wheel head. Draw your finger up until your finger hits the actual floor of the vessel and pull that up and forward. And that's like the measurement of how deep your floor is. So that's a great way to judge. I would say that's just a little over 1/2 inch. And that would be like the minimum that I'd want to leave there. When we compress the floor, very important step that we're always going to do, we minimize the depth just a little bit. It might decrease by about that much. When we cut the piece off with the wire, it loses about 1/16 of an inch, so we might lose about that much. And then when we actually trim the piece, which is a process that's coming down the road for us a little later, we'll lose just a little bit more, ending up with a floor that's probably, 3/8 or something like that. It's pretty slim so that we don't have too heavy of a piece. That little hole that we poked there will just close right up. Nothing to worry about. So that seems good. What we're going to do now is widen the piece, and often that looks just a lot like opening. The one difference here is, though, instead of pushing downward, I'm going to hook my fingers around the inside of the wall, and I'm just going to slowly, as that's rotating, I'm going to slowly pull that back toward myself. Just open that up. Now I do have a hand here that as I'm pulling back, I'm kind of bracing this hand against that. That's going to squeeze the wall a little bit and just kind of keep it in true. Sometimes if we open just loosely like this without any bracing on the outside wall, things can get a little off center, and that's just not what we want to have happen. So now I'm going to go in and compress the floor, and this is the first time amidst the pandemic that I'm pleased about the pandemic, the fact that it's forcing me to make these videos, because now finally you, the students, can see inside. No one will ever stand up and watch this during a demo for some reason. You can see inside what compressing the floor actually means. So I'm going to put a little bit of fluid in there, just a little bit of water, not too much. I'm going to go in. I actually have both sets of fingers here, and just one is plenty, but I like to have both. Why not get more surface area? And I'm going to start to push down and then slowly move from the outside edge in towards the center. Definitely I want to get on top of the center point and push down, and then move from the center point out to the outer edge, out to the outer perimeter of the floor. Okay, so that would be one compression. Now you probably want to go back and forth, I would say up to 10 times maybe. I want to feel that floor get a little more dense. Now I'm not drilling downward. I don't want to really minimize the depth of the floor too much. My goal is to kind of crush it, make it more dense, make it more rigid, make it more flat, make it more smooth possibly, depending on the piece that I'm working on. And remember, this isn't any kind of aesthetic choice right now. This is just a technical matter that helps our pieces not to crack in the floor when they're drying or when they're firing. And that's the most common way to lose kind of beginning thrown forms, is that we skip this step, or we don't give this step enough time. And as the piece dries, it puts the floor in a great deal of tension, and that floor will tend to crack as a way to give up or release the tension. And that's a bummer. We want to make this wonderful, beautiful thing. Perhaps part of its beauty is the fact that it can hold water. And when it can't do that any longer, it really, for most of us, reads as a total failure, even though the piece might be beautiful in other ways. So we want to compress that floor. So I've moved back and forth a number of times there. Let's do it once more just to be sure. Sometimes you'll hear little tiny air bubbles popping and cracking. You shouldn't have too much of that if you're wedging properly. And just as a quick insertion, any good throwing is the product of good wedging. All right, so the last step to compression, I'll always go in with a rib. Try and choose a rib that somehow matches the shape of the floor. So what I have here is a kind of a right angle, and I think that should work okay. And remember that you're typically working at 3 o'clock, so you'll see most of my work is being done at least to the right-hand side of center, which is kind of roughly at 3 o'clock. So I'm going to press down there. I can also turn to a softer curve of the rib, and that maybe with a little less surface area I can move back and forth just a little more easily there. So I'll go back and forth over the floor with a rib a few times. And again, this is not what it's going to look like in the end, but this is just the technical matter of making a nice dense floor. All right. Now we're going to go on to pulling the walls, and I'm glad also for the pandemic that you can see this from this perspective. This will really help, I think, for you throwers, especially you beginning throwers. So if this is a clock face, again, I'm going to be working mostly right here at 3 o'clock. Initially, though, my walls are moving outward a little bit, and if I want to move up cylindrically, I would rather start with that a little bit more of a cylindrical shape. So I'm going to squeeze just from both sides. That's now looking a little bit more vertical, and that feels a little better to me. I'm going to level off my rim just a little. That's that rim compression where we're squeezing the rim and then bringing this down to crowd it from all sides. So I'll just put that on there. Keep that rim in check. And now we'll go ahead and we'll pull the wall upward. From this vantage point, we probably won't really sense the height of the piece very much, but the good news is that we can see how the fingers are actually working on either side of the wall, how the hands are connecting over the top. So again, I'll connect over the top in some way, touching here or connecting, and then I'll try to kind of get these fingers to meet on either side of the wall here. And just a quick explanation for why we work over here at 3 o'clock. You can see if the clay is rotating in this direction, the clay is passing through and out my fingertips here. If I were to work anywhere else, like for example over here, you can say the clay is passing into my fingertips, and it's much more likely as I squeeze to not only kind of plow material up onto my hands, but potentially I can actually get hooked and draw my fingers backward. I'm not into that. I'm not into that. Therefore, I'm going to work not at 6 o'clock, not at 12 o'clock, not at 9, but at 3 is going to be the most comfortable place for us to work. Now, if you're left-handed, if any of you left-handers out there are feeling left out, maybe go ahead and reverse everything. The direction of the wheel, the time frame at which you work, all that stuff. Maybe, or just, sometimes you just bump along and you work right-handed on this stuff. Your left hand is involved. It's not just a right-handed activity, but you kind of give the, let's say, the responsibility back and forth between the hands depending on what you're doing in the throwing. So let's pull a wall. So I'm over here, I'm at 3 o'clock. I'm going to squeeze. I'm going to be nice and down low on the wall. I'm just going to give a slight deliberate pressure, and then I'm going to have those fingers rise very, very slowly through the whole height of the wall, which is something on the order of, I think it was about 3 inches. It's now about 5 inches. After each wall pull, I'm going to do a little compression of the rim, which again is pinching the rim, bringing a finger down on top, just kind of crowding it, leveling it, making it just a little thicker. And this works like a structure to keep the piece, again, from being too floppy and saggy. It gives it just a little bit of structure so that those things don't get the better of it during the forming. All right, let's pull that wall again. So again, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go right down to the wheel head on my outside hand. Reach kind of in underneath the clay ever so slightly. I'm going to try and open up my hand so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. And then I'm going to rise very, very slowly, hopefully hitting all the points along the way, not skipping over any sections of the piece. get up to the rim, and then I will just compress the rim a little bit there. So again, from this vantage point, we can't sense the height, but I think we're now at about maybe 6 or 7 inches tall, something like that. So I have a little bit of wobble in the piece. I think you can see that there, right? A little bit of wobble. That can be a little bit nerve-wracking, right? So let's remember this one. This will be a downward pull where we'll start at the top and then actually squeeze that wall. Let those fingers ride the wall downward from the top of the piece down towards the wheel head. The piece is a little taller now, so I can't connect my hands over the top any longer, but that helps to correct some of that wobble there. Okay, feels good. So we'll do one more pull. And you know, I can't say how many pulls of the wall it takes to get the piece finished. Everyone's a little different this way. There's no rules about this, that it should be 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 12. I would say, you know, one thing that can happen is if you're overworking a piece of clay, what's happening there is maybe you're spending a lot of time on it, you're touching it a lot. You are pushing water into the body of the clay the whole time, and it will get softer and softer. So at some point it will become so floppy and soft, and maybe thin too, that it just makes it really hard to work on the piece. I'd say on average it should probably take between about 10 minutes and maybe 20 minutes to make a thing. So I'm just using my wooden knife to just peel away a little bit of clay right down at the base. Compress my rim one more time. Just kind of touch the wall in a couple places to make this a little bit more of a strict cylinder. Okay. So once you're completed with throwing, you know, the rough shape, right? We'll shape this a little bit. But go ahead and reach in with your sponge. If there's any water down in the bottom, you can sponge that out, get that out of there. And now we can, at least from this vantage point, we can finish the interior. So I'll go in with that same rib. My goal is to make contact with the floor. And in this case, I'm not going to be fancy or even artistic. I'm just going to render that smooth. I've ended up with a little circle in the center. I don't mind that. I think I'll leave that there. And then I'll just move the rib up through the wall. So the piece is probably about 8 inches high now. It's a little taller than I can't join my hands over the top anymore. So in this case, I just need to be really kind of careful and really feel with my fingertips if, you know, if I'm touching this rib on the other side of the wall or not. Just moving through the wall there with the rib. Very basic cylinder form. And since I have this aerial point of view for you guys right now, we'll go ahead and we'll just play with the rim a little bit, because that's the one thing that you'll really be able to see from this vantage point. So I'm going to use my knife here, and I'm actually just going to split the rim. This is just to kind of play around and do something a little bit different, something a little less traditional with the actual rim. So we have a split rim there. Clean my hands off. We'll just tack those two rims together in a number of places and arrive at something a little bit different. Suppose this would be called altering the rim. So once we've altered and changed the rim a little bit, we can come back with other tools and continue to throw and continue to make different changes to the piece. Again, your vantage point won't be able to show you anything else, so we'll go ahead and stop there. So that is centering, compressing the floor, opening, and then building the wall.